Well, I don't know how many of you have spring colds. I have a really bad one right now for the last several days, probably the worst one I can think of in a long time. And it's kicking my butt a little bit, so I have to apologize. My voice is a little bit different. We'll make our way through these videos. And I'm thinking about this video, Whitetail Habitat Solutions. A lot of people come here to this channel for the habitat. I don't know why you come, what your reason is. Especially this time of year, people are coming from habitat. But I can say the highest percentage of my subscriber base has to do with whitetail hunting strategy, and they come here for whitetail hunting strategy. Probably 80%, 70% of the numbers for viewers on this channel come in September, October, November, December, especially October, November. It's just a huge jump in growth, an exponential amount of growth from August, September, October. It just really builds. And that's my favorite time of the year. I'm pretty biased. I came into this because I love to hunt deer hunt. I love to hunt deer. I love deer hunting. That really stirs my soul, as Fred Bear would say, I guess, back in the day. But it's something that really grabs you. And that's what captivates me. I wouldn't do the whitetail habitat. I wouldn't work on whitetail habitat. I wouldn't go to clients if I didn't first love deer hunting and have that experience of deer hunting all over on public land. That's where I mostly hunted, or private land, do it myself. And so that's where my love lies. So it's hard for me to not have hunting strategy videos 100% of the year, here and there that we're shooting. We're shooting 5 to 7 videos today, and we're gonna have a few on hunting strategy. A lot of it though relates back to deer habitat. So to me, something like this topic right here, 3 ways to hunt nocturnal bucks, it directly relates to how you approach your habitat, how you approach your hunt in the off season. And a lot of this relates to public land as well, and how pressure affects deer, and how when you leave areas alone, and how you can set up areas, you can have a great hunt. So we're going to talk about this topic. For those of you that are here for bedding area videos and food plots and how to put trail cameras out, things that are more habitat related, mock scrapes, bear with me, because there's a lot of hunting strategy that you need to employ right now. We're shooting this the end of April for your deer hunt. And if you wait till September, October to get some of these strategies in place, you're going to be really behind for your hunt and how much of a quality herd you have this fall. Because the quality herd is not dictated by how much you spend on deer habitat. It's how much you improve without over improving, and still related to how you can effectively hunt the land without spooking deer. Because if you spend too much, you spread all your habitat improvements around the property, you go out on the property and you spook deer, then you're not gonna have a great hunt. You're not gonna have a great hunt or herd. Those two go together. You can't have a great herd without a great hunt. I talk about it all the time. I want you to be one of the herd influencers, those 5% of all landowners that actually influence the whitetail herd, no matter how much money you spend. First point here I want to make with this is you need to admit there is likely a problem. When all you have are nocturnal bucks, nocturnal mature bucks, then there's a problem. And we'll talk about that problem at the end down here. And there's a few likelihood scenarios that are controllable by you. And most people aren't controlling those scenarios. So then you develop a nocturnal herd. And the problem with the nocturnal herd is when you have nocturnal bucks, and the bulk of the bucks in the area are coming in after dark, they're not really focusing on your property as a priority in their 24-hour cycle of priority. And what I mean by that is the daylight is what dictates who builds a herd, who builds a great hunt, and really what protects mature bucks, what advances them to the next age class. So they get shot, they get killed when they're younger, but as they get older, as they age into a mature buck, they settle into areas that they can call home during the daylight, and those areas are sacred. Where they're at night is not sacred. They can be anywhere. They can be absolutely anywhere. If they have a 3-mile home range, they express a very high percentage of that after dark. We don't care about after dark. If they're not focusing on your land during daylight, then all you're doing is for naught. And there's likely some problems that we'll talk about. Number 1 though, hunt is a bedding area, not a food source. So many times we go to clients, talk to readers, viewers, and they'll say, my neighbor got that giant buck. They even think the neighbors are poaching sometime. When you start to really talk to the people, they're hunting largely on food plots, hoping that buck that showed himself during daylight on a food source in September follows that same pattern in October, November, despite the fact that you're hunting that same food source multiple times a week or multiple times a month consistently, to where he knows that you're there, he just leaves. And the problem is when a nocturnal buck leaves your land, It gets to a point where he doesn't even come back during the nighttime because you're not a part of his priority of movement in his overall core range. He can have a 3-mile home range. He might visit your land during the night here and there, but he's gone. And you know he's not going to come back for a big pile of does on your land, because that's what happens. The more money you spend incorrectly on your deer habitat, the more does you have, the more likely that buck will be there after dark and not during the daylight. Focus on hunting him near his bedding area. If you have quality food, oak flat out on public land. Nearby people that are baiting on private land and you're hunting public land somewhere that allows baiting on private but not public. You get into that public land hotspot in his bedding area, wait for him to come off his food source, whether it's a morning food source or after dark, and then you hunt him his bedding area. It's a great tactic on public land. Instead of finding this ever-revolving source of food, you find where he's actually going back into a bedding area. And this area can be very, very large. You're not going to find a needle in a haystack out on 65,000 acres on a public land spot. But instead, everyone's focusing on those food sources. Now, you have to know that food source. And what I find is those bucks will change their bedding area based on that food source. They don't want to be a mile away from the current food source. So if there's a clear cut that they're going to in December, and that's where they're feeding, they're probably not going to back to that white oak flat that was dropping those acorns in September. Instead, they're going to relocate a mile and a half away, and they're going to change their bedding area. So you need to know the food sources. You need to anticipate the movements and when they're switching to that other food source, anticipate where people are hunting, and then go find that location in his bedding area, and it becomes a lot easier to hunt. Because if it's rutting time, he'll move around a lot in that bedding area. If it's cold in December, late November, he's going to get up and move and feed. He's going to feed twice during his bedding hours. He might only move 50 yards, 100 yards, but he's going to be in that location. He's not used to anybody being there. That golden ticket hotspot is where he has grown, where he has aged, and there's very few of those areas that he relies on, and they feel safe to him, and he's going to go find that area. If you find that area on public or private land, you're going to find where he's at. Instead, if you're hunting the food source, public land, you're competing with the other people. Private land, people tend to overhunt the food sources. Just same with on public land, there's just more bodies doing it. But once you hunt that food source incorrectly and you spook deer off 1 or 2 times, that oldest buck in the neighborhood is not going to like it. He's not going to appreciate your efforts. And that can have a ripple effect of several hundred acres around that major food source. So if it's a bigger food plot, the bigger the reach for expressing problems when you hunt it poorly. However, if you allow the deer to continue to hit that food source and you don't spook them, that means they'll be in those bedding areas even if another buck takes its place because you missed them, because you spooked them. They want to hit that afternoon food source that's high quality, whether it's on public or private land, and they want to hit it during the daylight. That means he's going to be bedding nearby, on average, within 200 yards to 600 yards, 700 yards in the average habitat out there. Not I hunt in the UP of Michigan where it's more wilderness. You might find those bucks bedding 3/4 mile to a mile away from where people are baiting, and that becomes the traditional main food source during the November and December months, part of October. Because of all commotion, the four-wheelers coming in, dropping bait off, people going in, sitting on the bait pile, spooking deer off, and because of the abundance of cover, I find that bucks move further and further away from that afternoon food source. But that's not the case in probably where 90% of you hunt, 80% of you hunt. Now, bottom line, it's the same concepts, it's just a greater distance. And you get into northern Ohio where you have coverless ag regions and very small woodlots. Those bucks obviously aren't going to be very far from their afternoon food source because they're packed into very small pockets of cover, surrounded by food, and they're just moving 100 yards during the daylight, hitting their food source. So it becomes very easy to pinpoint exactly where they're at. Sometimes a lot harder to hunt, but at the same time, when you know where they're at during the daylight, you got them. Food source, easy to spook out, ruin the entire land, or ruin the entire hunt. Doesn't matter if it's public land or private land. Number 2, leave them alone. You know what's crazy about nocturnal bucks, and we'll discuss in a little bit? Nocturnal bucks aren't actually nocturnal. They're moving somewhere during the daylight. Always keep that in mind. I wrote an article a long time ago, 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, talking about the lies of nocturnal bucks. It's a myth, the myth of nocturnal bucks. Bucks don't become nocturnal. Instead, they just simply move. What's amazing is if you have good habitat that you're hunting, public or private land, you have a good food source, you have good bedding areas, it's crazy how when you leave those areas alone and there's not that hunting pressure expressed in those areas, then after 3 or 4 weeks of forgiveness, that mature buck will move back. Check your trail cameras. It's amazing how many bucks move back onto a parcel 2 months after the season ends. We're out there scouting property in February and March, and we're hearing from a landowner they haven't seen a buck since November, December. All of a sudden, we're out there, we find fresh rubs with shavings on top of the snow. We find dozens of beds, pellets. We kick deer out, we move them. So, well, this is the most deer I've seen in a long time. Well, it's because it's the first time there hasn't been someone on the land for a couple months. They've passed those weeks of forgiveness, and then those bucks return. It's amazing how nocturnal bucks become daylight bucks when you just simply leave them alone. And that's why we practice hunting and killing mature bucks while sitting on the couch. That's the number one way to make smart decisions of actually when you go into the woods. Calculated decisions, look at the weather. The weather can guide you to success. There's days out there, I call them 40-50% days, where you have a 40% chance going into that bedding area because you've set it up, you've left them alone, and killing that buck. If you were on those wrong weather days, you have 1% chance, 3% chance. It's all about those odds. And there's no amount of those bad percentage days that add up to a good percentage sit. I hope that makes sense. You can't make up for 1 or 2 or 5 quality sits with 50 bad sits because those deer just simply avoid your property. They appear nocturnal when you've pushed them, and maybe a lot of other hunters in the area a mile away or more, and that's why they come deer in the middle of the night. They don't have just 300 yards to come to that food source and you get a picture of them at 2 a.m. Instead, they've come a mile, mile and a half. That's why it's so random. That's why they're so hard to hunt. Just leave them alone. And it's amazing how those nocturnal bucks turn daylight and you get a chance to hunt them. Just let your property heal. It takes time to heal. I would call it 3 to 4 weeks of forgiveness. Number 3, hunt them as a non-core rut buck. And that's something you don't have a lot of control over. They're just bucks that live 3/4 of a mile away. But you have good property. You have good food source. You have a good area to hunt. This could happen on public land a lot, where you have good bedding. You left it alone. During the rut, that buck will be walking through. That's how a lot of hunting careers are made on public land, because you have a great funnel stand on the rut, on public land, during the rut, on public land, and you might shoot a buck from 2 miles away. His core daylight area is 2 miles away. But because you're hunting good food, good cover, and there's a smattering of does around, he knows that he can visit that spot during the rut, and you're going to get a chance to kill him. He won't be there during September, October. You have to wait for him to come over as a non-core rut buck. Core bucks are the ones that are in and around your land all the time if you're not over pressuring them, and if you, at the end here, have good habitat. You need to hunt November. If you're on public land, you hunt November cover, November food. If you're in December, you hunt December food, December cover. You have to know the changing cover on private land. You have to build it so you have good cover, good food. There's a difference. You find it on public land, you build it on private land, but it's the same concepts. You still have to leave it alone. You still have to pick the right days to go in the woods. You still have to understand that there is a problem. And on private land, if you have bad habitat, you're going to have nocturnal bucks, if any at all, because a mature buck especially will find the best food source in the area. So you have to have all-season food, all-season cover for those bucks to be around and actually establish a core range on your property. Those core range bucks are pretty easy to kill if you hunt correctly, if your property isn't set up for you to fail, if it's set up for success, so you can actually get on and off the property without spooking deer. Hunting pressure. You have to hunt. You have to remove the hunting pressure. This is something I want you to be very critical with your trail cameras this year. Watch when you go on the property, when you know you had a good weekend of hunting where you disturbed the property, how long does it take for those mature bucks to come back? I'm talking about the oldest bucks in the neighborhood. That could be 2 in your area, that could be 7 in your area. It's all relative. The bottom line is the oldest bucks won't be on your land if you overpressure the land. I know a lot of people that shoot some 4 or 5-year-old bucks like crazy. They build a wall full of 4 or 5-year-old bucks, but they're not shooting the 6 and 7-year-olds in the area, or those 5-year-olds consistently, the 6, 7. They have older bucks. I'm talking about some of those fantasy land states where you have these big old bruisers that people are hunting. I have a previous client, Corey, out in Iowa. He hunts Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas. He seems to narrow down to the best buck of the year. He knows when it's going to be on his land. He lets them go to that 6, 7-year-old range, and he goes out there when they're at their best, during the right month to shoot them, during the right weather, the right day. And guess what? He kills them 90% of the time. I remember a buck he was after a few years ago, ended up being a 220, 30-inch buck. It was killed on the road in the velvet. That was one he didn't get. And literally, those that he didn't get are far, far fewer than the ones he shoots, because he's a tactician. He waits for the right time, the right month. He sets up his land for success, and he goes in there and he kills them. complete lack of pressure. There's not a lot of people hunting around in that area. It's a little bit different, more fantasy land. But at the same time, he makes right decisions so he can shoot the oldest bucks in the area, not just a good buck. He has 180-inch bucks, 170-inch bucks he passes up because he's after those older dominant bucks. He shoots some of those older ones that are lower scoring than some of the ones he's saving for the next year because they were simply a 4-year-old buck. That's when you know someone's dialed in, when they're just simply shooting the oldest bucks in the neighborhood and not a buck just to fill a tag. Hunting pressure is just huge. You guys... And that's the problem with private land, is people try to do so much, they do too much, increases the amount of pressure on the land, not in the off season, but when they're actually hunting. Because they set themselves up every time they go on and off the property, there's a chance of spooking deer. Where on public land, people are a little bit smarter, they're more tactical. They actually, deer feeding here, bedding here, they go in between, they watch the wind, and they go hunt. The deer are none the wiser. But finally, one reason that bucks are nocturnal on your land or where you hunt is simply too many does. Simply too many does. Does take up space. Does and fawns, I'll include fawns. Let me ask you this. Yearling bucks disperse and move. A 1.5-year-old buck, first set of antlers, is a yearling buck. A yearling is not a fawn is not a yearling. A fawn is a few months old. A yearling is a 1.5-year-old, over a year old. They disperse an average of 1.5 miles away from their home fawning grounds. Why is that? They're not doing it for the fun of it. In fact, I think they'd prefer to stay home if we could ever possibly figure that out. It's amazing because a lot of times you see that they have a barbell effect. They move 1.5 miles away, they set up a core area, and all of a sudden that non-core area becomes where they actually were fawned. There's some studies that show that barbell effect. But bottom line is, they move because of female social pressure. The majority of the year, the non-rut time, bucks don't like female social pressure. They avoid it. That's why they left their nest, so to speak, in the first place, because their mother and probably subordinate offspring kick them out of the herd. And where they settle on, they don't want a property overrun with does. They just left an area because of female social pressure. So they go, your land overrun with does, don't expect them to stick. Now, they might come through after dark, they might be a nocturnal buck. But just because it's a rut doesn't mean that it's going to come back. Remember, they've already established their daylight, core, precious, golden ticket area somewhere else during the daylight. They're not putting a high priority on your land at all. They don't actually come onto your land. So what I find is when you have too many does, you're pressuring, you won't even see some of the oldest bucks in the neighborhood, even though they might have a core area only 1/2 mile away, mile away, because you're simply over pressuring the land. And I'm not talking during the off season. I'm talking, I always say, about a month before the season begins, 2 to 3 weeks before the season begins, before bow season. Let's say it's a September 15th bow opener. If you're starting to really lay off the pressure around end of August, first part of September, and then starting that pressure back off the day after the season ends. Maybe you won't find a lot of sheds, but you're not going to disturb your hunt or your herd as it relates to building a quality herd for the following year. Something to think about. Too many does, always a bad thing. Again, I always talk about there's balance. There's a certain number of does that becomes balance, point of balance, with the most number of bucks that you can have on your property focusing during the daylight. Once that number of does increases over that perfect balance point, the number of bucks decreases that you'll potentially have on your land. Pretty easy thing to see as we travel around the country and we experience this for really literally our careers and our profession. It's something we see all the time. The more does you have, the fewer bucks you have. At the same time, if you don't have any does and fawns on your land, that means your land stinks. There's no good habitat. There's no good fall food, fall cover. If does and fawns aren't there, those bucks aren't going to be there, obviously. Does and fawns on your land, wanting to live on your land, that's a good sign. That's a good sign that deer actually want to be on your land. But there's a lot of other things you can control. Your hunting pressure, what you plant, how you create the habitat, the timing of when you hunt, staying on the couch more, not spooking deer. There's a lot of things you can do under your control. Hunt the bedding area instead of the food source. Don't blow out the food sources so that you have a great hunt and never really experience nocturnal bucks. You want to be the land that sucks them in. Again, going back to that 5% herd influencer, that's why so few properties are actually herd influencers. In fact, some of the properties that influence a herd most negatively that we see are the ones that work on their land the most, are the most zealous, the most passionate. They just do it to a point that keeps them from hunting the land. Always remember, the lowest hole in the bucket is how your land is hunted before any type of habitat that you create or anything, because then you have a chance of shooting a random monster coming through that hasn't already been educated to your nocturnal efforts, to your efforts to actually create a nocturnal herd instead of a daylight herd. So 3 great ways to hunt mature bucks that appear nocturnal. Keep the pressure off, leave them alone. Hunt them as a non-core rut buck. You just simply live somewhere else during the daylight. You're waiting to hunt that buck as a non-core until the rut, not before. And I'll add something about that non-core buck in that non-core area. It seems like, well, it's a needle in a haystack. He's living a mile and a half away. But you only have about a 7 to 10 day window there of opportunity. So when you look at those 7 to 10 days, let's say in Wisconsin, southwest Wisconsin, where we're at the first 2 weeks of November, you might look at that weather and say, wow, there's only 3 or 4 days that are cool, not high winds, not stormy, and those are the days he's going to be on your land. So sometimes those non-core bucks are pretty easy to hone in and kill. It seems like they're not. But he's told you he's going to come back as a non-core buck. You've seen that for a long time. You can look at the weather. You know he's not going to come back until the rut. You have 7 to 10 days out of the entire 365 to pick to hunt him. You have 3 good days. You go in there and you kill him. It sounds easy, and sometimes it really is. It's not the needle in a haystack that you might think. Again, hunt him in his bedding area, not the food source. Take these 3 hunting tactics, turn them into success. Make sure you limit your mistakes, and you'll find that the great thing about this, it takes 1 off season to turn it all around so you can hunt daylight bucks this fall. Now I'm excited again this year to host our Camp Kicking Bear charity event. Last year we did it in June, and it was a big success. We were able to raise over $21,000 for Camp Kicking Bear. There's some people that actually made comments that they get sick of hearing about this kind of stuff and whatever else. I think they didn't understand that we're actually raising money. This Camp Kicking Bear is, to me, the #1 children's organization that gets kids in the outdoors, their families, especially a lot of kids that don't have the opportunity to do so otherwise. June 11th, I'll have more details coming out about this, but you can email us for early registration. June 11th, it'd be midday, like 11 to 4 type thing, 10 to 5, 10 to 4. What I do is there's 50 people that register for this. We give that all to Camp Kicking Bear. Well, it's a habitat day. We go out for a couple hours on the property, and I show you some strategies that you can take home to your own land. Number 3, we have a hunt raffle for 100 people. The registration for 50 people is $300. That gets you in the door to actually see the property and the land. $100 gets you in a hunt raffle times 100 people. We had Leo from Lower Michigan had a hunt last year, many memories, end of September for a couple days. Number 4, lots of door prizes, Matthews bows, blinds. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we give away, really good stuff for you too. Kids are free. I think we had about 25, 30 kids last year. All proceeds, again, go to Kicking Bear. Every dollar, every dime we raise goes to Kicking Bear. We'll have some other auction. Last year, Chris B came. We might have Kevin Smith, retired Major League Baseball player. I hear that Gary Suter, he's a NHL Hall of Famer. He might show up too. So there's some chance to meet there. And then, of course, Ray Howell. He was here last year. He delivered his testimony. It was an awesome, inspirational talk that he gave to everyone. Hope to see you there. Look for further details on the site and then the description for the video.